Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing very well. I know this is a very busy time for you, but I'm in the same boat. Just a reminder that your research papers or your essays are due April 2nd, and the final test will close on April 11th. It will open on the 9th and it will close on April 11th. Okay, so let's put that aside. Just one more thing. I'm looking forward to reading your papers, and I will respond to any emails throughout the weekend. If you get really stuck with something and you want to run it by me before you submit your final draft of your research paper, then shoot me an email. And if I respond in time and that's helpful, that's great. If not, then, well, that's just a matter of time for you when you do that, so I can help you in some way. Anyway, let's talk about the final chapter and its also its relevance for the chapter on schizophrenia. Okay, so here's the diagram from the last chapter on personal identity and time. And before I get into details and its relationship to schizophrenia, I want to say a few things about personal identity or psychological continuity. North of, in the last chapter, as you can see, North of purposefully takes us on a tour of the potential candidates for personal identity. And as you can see, it's not an easy task. As you can also see or have seen, it's not an easy task to talk about the self, consciousness, and its relationships to the brain. So it's not an easy task to talk about personal identity either. Even though many have tried before, and there are notable attempts today, we still haven't figured out the details, and there are still serious debates in the literature. Okay, so North of reminds us that it is the difficulty in describing, or maybe not so much describing the problem, but the difficulty in coming up, the difficulty in coming up with an answer to personal identity for psychological beings like human beings is that everything in human nature changes. Let me just bring up the diagram again. Excuse me. So everything in human nature changes. And so what that means is that if we want to nail down the properties or a property or properties or cluster of properties or characteristics that maintain personal identity over time, that's going to be difficult because everything physical, everything psychological, almost everything, as we have seen, as we will see soon, and everything neuronal and chemical about our nature changes on a regular basis. So it's quite difficult to nail down what would it take, what would be the best candidate to determine personal identity or psychological identity over time. Northrop has looked at memory. That doesn't work because memory changes on a regular basis. It can be fallacious and it can also lie to us. What about the body? Well, the body physically changes on a regular basis. The body renews itself, sheds all cells and creates new cells, whether it's skin cells, eye cells, or neuronal cells. What about the brain? Well, the brain, what we know about the brain now is that the brain is a biological machine that changes on a regular basis too. It also goes through specific patterns of neuronal change and neuronal functioning. And we have seen that in reference to the brain's resting state in the form of variability or variability in frequency or neuronal oscillations. So there's quite a bit of change in the brain, and specifically in the brain's resting state. Excuse me. So what can we latch on? What can we use to determine personal identity over time? It's not as you can see, it's not an easy task. So one way out of this is to marry two positions together that are seemingly contradictory or paradoxical. Northrop points to the brain as the best candidate for personal identity over time, in line with Nagel. As you remember from the chapter, Parfit argues against Nagel's position. Parfit emphasizes the role of survivability or survival as the hallmark of personal identity, and Nagel points to the brain. And in addition to that, he qualifies it, although he doesn't answer exactly what it is. He says there must be something about the brain. There's an additional fact about the brain. The brain is very important. We know that from the medical sciences, especially neurology. We know that the brain is quite important, but what is it about the brain that's quite important? What is that additional fact? And today we can answer that question better. We don't have definitive answers, but Northrop tries to answer that question more accurately or more comprehensively, considering that we have access to imaging studies and clinical studies and just neuroscientific studies. So Northrop says, look, what seems to be the hallmark of the brain is this constant variability, constant discontinuity, neuronal discontinuity in the form of variability. Different mechanisms, different frequencies, oscillations, coupling and decoupling in time as the brain hums throughout the day and throughout the night. So change is a constant here, and there are specific changes or specific patterns to these changes. So that's one element. Now, the other element that's important is that consciousness and self are correlated with all of these changes, neuronal changes, or the brain's resting state activity. So when there is specific and discontinuous or variable resting state activity, then that gives rise to consciousness and specific features of the self. Okay, the two go hand in hand. There's a correlation. There is also most likely a very specific causal story. We know that the two are related in important ways. We haven't nailed down the causal chains yet. Most likely we will in time, although there are some skeptics who say we will never do so, but we can put that aside for now. Now, since that's the case, since there's a very close relationship and a causal story here, even though we haven't hammered out all the details of that causal relationship, we know that there is an important relationship between what the brain does and our psychological states or psychological content, in general, consciousness or the mind. Now, we also know from the clinical literature that when the brain's resting state variability, neuronal variability, but also chemical variability or chemical processes in specific neuronal pathways cease to function or cease to perform typical work, then consciousness ceases to operate or ceases to be. So again, we can see that from pathological cases, vegetative cases, brain death cases, coma cases, we can see that with the cessation of brain activity or with brain death, there is also death to consciousness. So this is an aha moment for Northrop. He says, okay, look, specific changes of variability in the brain give rise to consciousness. Yes, on one hand, change cannot mean identity over time, because that's a paradox. Logically speaking or conceptually speaking, it doesn't work. It does not compute logically. But here logic is not enough. We need to also look at empirical studies, clinical studies, what we know about the brain from an empirical perspective. And when you marry the two, especially the relationship between the resting state and psychological states, consciousness in general, and specific features of self, personal identity comes about from this relationship. So Northrop says, look, personal identity is about psychological continuity. And the hallmark of psychological continuity, you can say, is consciousness and states of consciousness and contents of consciousness. Okay, so when you put all of that together, that's the picture that emerges. Specific brain mechanisms go through specific, coupled with specific functionality or variability in the brain's resting state, go hand in hand with or are necessary for consciousness. And the reverse is also true. So here is the hallmark of personal identity for Northrop, and this is in support of Nagel's claim from the mid-70s. Although Nagel did not have the neuroscientific data that we have access to today, nevertheless, he knew that the brain is important. He just didn't know the details that we know today. Okay, so now with this marriage between variability, change, and psychological continuity, we can overcome the paradox of the logical paradox that identity can be found in change. All right. So now, how does this relate to what we have said, what Northrop has said about schizophrenia and and also some of the claims that he makes at the end of the last chapter, such as human beings are beings in time, and our identity is really existential. As you remember, the relationship here to schizophrenia boils down to the relationship of the brain to its environment. We have seen that a significant disruption in the relationship between the brain and its specific mechanisms, i.e. The brain's resting state, to the environment cause specific symptoms of schizophrenia, such as hallucinations, delusions, and splitting of the ego, or the creation or invention of alternative ego. And this symptom is really representative of the notion of schizophrenia, because schizophrenia is composed of two words: schizo or schism, which is a splitting, bifurcation, and phrenia, which is awareness, so splitting of awareness or splitting of consciousness. And in the case of schizophrenia, in the case of Andrew, that is, we see this quite clearly. Andrew, in order to maintain some kind of relationship with its environment, has to come up, not intentionally, has to come up with an identity. The identity that he comes up with is different from his previous identity, but there is one common element, and the common element is mathematics. Not the quality of mathematics, but just mathematics. His new identity is that he's related to Albert Einstein, and this is somehow related to mathematics because he wants to teach mathematics to the world. And this is deep into his symptoms of schizophrenia. But he can't really teach mathematics because there is the disarray in his thought processes is so deep or substantial that he can't really engage in mathematics. He can't really engage in following a logical narrative, following a logical sequence of mathematical moves anymore, which is also exemplified in the way he relates to the world. His relationship to the world is fragmented. The self is also fragmented. So his relationship to the world is out of tune. His relationship to himself, his self, is out of tune or fragmented, and that's also exemplified in his trains of thought. His trains of thought are disjointed, illogical, chaotic, because he has removed himself into a place away from the world, into a psychological place or psychological world that is really severed from its environment. And the symptoms of that are hallucinations and delusions. So it shows the importance of the attunement of brain-based time with world-based time. And the mechanism here, potential mechanism here that Northrop points to is frequency cross-coupling. So what happens in the brain's resting state, the brain goes through various neuronal oscillations, electrical neuronal oscillations. With that, there are also various chemical processes that take place on regular basis, with the help of the brainstem and the limbic system. So this work takes place on regular basis in the brain, but it has to be in tune with the world. So this is the world and this is the brain. It has to be, they have to work together. The moment when they are severed, when they are disjointed, the world of the person, of the subject, veers off, and the external world, where it does what it does. It just is, but it no longer informs the subject. And since it no longer informs the subject slips into pathology such as depression and schizophrenia, or depersonalization, or what used to be called multiple personality disorder, or dissociative disorder, that is. So here we see this crucial connection between what is generated in the brain, the temporal frame, or the temporal dimension that's created in the brain. Subjectively, we experience it psychologically, but it is deeply informed by what is happening in the environment or in the world. And a simple example, even beyond the pathological examples that we have seen, and they're quite intricate, but there are specific features, specific symptoms, and specific patterns that repeat, as you can see now. But on daily basis, we go through, waking and sleeping cycles. So during the day, we work, we roam the world, we are involved with the world, we work, we engage our families, and we socialize with other people. So we are embedded in the world in various ways, practically. But when the day changes to night, then it's time to sleep. So we are in tune with the world. We are awake during the day and we fall asleep at various times at night. But on average, typically that is the case with human beings, even though our dream states do not reflect what happens in the world. Because the world of dreams is quite different. It can be, to some extent, it can relate to the world. So it is often the case that we dream about trivial matters. You may dream about stressing over your exams or your research paper, or being on time, or your relationships, or the fight that you had with your parents, or going to the movies with your friends or with your loved ones, whatever it may be. But this is called day's residue, the residue from the content from your daily experiences, or the residue from your daily experiences. And this comes up in our dream states on a regular basis. But we also go through dream states that are quite fantastical, that we conjure up, our brains conjure up stories, fantastical stories, quite pleasant or quite scary stories during our sleeping states or intervals that are completely out of tune or incongruent with what the world is or what the world does. So we can be out of sync or incongruent or out of tune with the world. But nevertheless, the fact that we are sleeping is in tune with the world. So this is just a simple and practical example to show that the the temporal clock or temporal phases of time are reflected in the way we function on a daily basis. And in pathological cases, you can see that the more the brain is out of tune with its environment, the worse its functional states and psychological states. So that is why Northrop says we are beings in time, and our existence really is the way we are in the world is, our identity, he says, the loss of the continuity of self, of the sense of self over time, culminates in eventual identity change that has deep metaphysical existential implications. So this is reflective, or another way stating what he means by being in time. Because we, as the way we function in our world, on Earth, that is in tune with specific temporal cycles of the world, at a larger scale and at a more a local scale. And that also reflects in the way, in the phases or the changes to psychological states or states of consciousness, such as wakefulness or dream states. So brain-based time is really a neuronal claim, but also a psychological claim, because brain-based time gives rise to the way we experience ourselves and the world in psychological way. But the way we experience ourselves as psychological beings is intimately connected, or directly connected and influenced by the temporal cycles of the world. So that is why Northrop says we are beings in time. There is this temporal dimension to our lives, to our existence, that unfolds on a regular basis and that affects us on a regular basis. The moment when we are out of tune with the world is not necessarily immediately, but it's the changes are not perhaps pathological changes don't ensue immediately, but they do, or they are directly caused by a disruption in the relationship of brain-based time with world-based time. And again, we see that in the case of depression and in the case of schizophrenia. We looked at Judy and we looked at Andrew. In the case of Judy, Judy withdraws from the world. The moment when she completely withdraws from the world, after her withdrawal from the world, she resides only in her own psychological world, and that in effect causes specific symptoms, clinical symptoms of depression. The same case is with Andrew, in schizophrenia. Andrew does not withdraw from the world in the same way that Judy does, but his relationship to the world is completely distorted, to the extent that his sense of self is disjointed. He has no sense of personal identity over time. And his personal identity at a time, or synchronic unity, what I have mentioned this at the beginning of the course, and here in the last chapter, Northrop revisits this idea. Andrew's newly acquired identity at a time is one that is incongruent or in contrast to his prior identity. So he lives through a series of disjointed senses of self. And that culminates in his newly acquired identity. Various hallucinations and delusions. So Northup's claim that the self is really neurosocial, also, even though he doesn't say it in the last chapter, I think we can hear its echoes because it is compatible with what he says at the end of the chapter on temporality, brain-based time, and world-based time. Remember that the thesis of the neurosocial thesis is that we are deeply embedded in our social environments, physical environments and social environments, to the extent that our environment and our social environment, physical and social environment, that is, affect us on a daily basis, and they shape us psychologically through specific neuronal mechanisms and plasticity. And this is true for children, and this is also true for adults. So the lesson here is that we are deeply embedded in our environments, and we are deeply connected to the temporal dimension of the world. And the temporal dimension of the world is partly and to a great extent reflected in the brain-based dimension, or the psychological dimension, the psychological temporal dimension that we enjoy on a daily basis from the first person perspective. Considering this, you can see that there are a few themes consistently running through the book. One is that we are neurosocial beings. Okay, our identities, our psychological identities, our consciousness is deeply connected or driven by specific neural mechanisms. However, we are always embedded in environments, physical environments and social environments, and they affect us and develop us throughout our lives. Okay, so that's one theme that has run throughout the book, and it's exemplified by the neurosocial thesis. The other one is that the brain's resting state seems to be quite important for understanding what is consciousness and how it functions and how it relates to the self. And also how it relates to the difference between the clinical differences between consciousness and lack of it. More specifically, the difference between, for example, typical wakefulness, vegetative state, coma, or minimally conscious states. So that's the other theme, the importance of the brain's resting state for consciousness and specific features of self. And the third theme is that as human beings, our lives unfold temporally. We live according to a temporal dimension. You could say that we live according to a spatial dimension, the way we enjoy our environment and also the environment of our psyche or our psychological environment. You can say that we live in this conscious spatial dimension, because consciousness has all of these characteristics that we can tap into on, almost at will. So we can tap into memory, we can tap into creativity, distinct types of cognition, deduction, induction, convergent thinking, divergent thinking, synthesizing information, evaluating various sensory motor information. Okay, all of this you can look at it from the perspective of this psychological or cognitive toolkit that we use on a regular basis to exist, to roam in the world, to establish relationships with other people, and in general, to survive. So we have access to this psychological or cognitive toolkit that in its application has to be in tune with the world. And one way to do that is to be in tune temporally with the world, because the world unfolds or revolves temporally, has a temporal dimension. And for the subject, or for the human being to survive in the world, it has to be to some extent in tune with the world, or in tune with the cycles of the world. The moment when it severs itself, for whatever reason, the moment it veers off, that's when pathology ensues. And with the cases of depression and schizophrenia and depersonalization, we have seen that is the case. Okay, so again, 3 important themes: the neurosocial claim, the temporal claim, and the embeddedness claim. And I think Northrop has done a good job in supporting his claims conceptually and empirically, with the use of his analyses, conceptual analyses, and with the use of the literature that he cites. Okay, so I think that is it. This is our last week, and there's one more discussion board that you have to do. But I think at this point, it is also fair to say that you have done a pretty good job in engaging discussions. I think you have shown that you are capable of addressing some of the most difficult concepts, and also replying to your classmates. So good job on that front. And overall, even though the course is not finished and I still have to grade your essays and your final test, thus far, you should also pat yourself on the back, because the literature that you have been reading is not easy. The concepts are not easy to understand, and Northrop cites, and other authors cite empirical studies that are really new to you. And talking about analyzing information, talking about deliberating, reflecting and writing on consciousness and the self is not easy. So good job on that front, that you have been able to so far do so. And as I can see in your discussion boards, you have done that. You have done that relatively well, which means in the future you will be able to tackle such problems with more information and with more ease, which I think will be quite important for you, not only professionally but also personally. But there's also an irony here, because as you can see, it is difficult to talk about the self and consciousness, even though the self and consciousness are the experiences and the concepts are very close to us. We live them on a daily basis. We wouldn't be able to talk about the self and consciousness if we were not conscious. We have access to conscious content. Yes, conscious content, conscious states, various psychological or cognitive tricks or toolkits on daily basis. Without them, you wouldn't be able to go to school, and you wouldn't be able to be successful in school. So you have all this direct and intimate contact with the self and consciousness, but at the same time, it's quite difficult to intelligently, logically talk about consciousness and the self. So there is an element of irony here, but even though there is this paradox or irony, you have been doing a good job, and you should, even though the course is not over, you should congratulate yourself. Okay, so I will end it here. Again, looking forward to reading your papers, and I wish you all the best in your exam session. So take care for now, and all the best.